Welcome to the first of our online lectures. Now in this video what I want to do is start covering the things we need to know before we even get to U.S. history. Now this is basically going to be a refresher of things you learned in pre-AP world history. And the three things that we need to know before we get to U.S. is the Protestant Reformation, the Catholics and Protestants in England, and the story of the European exploration of the New World. But this video is going to focus on the Protestant Reformation. Now the Catholic Church was the only real church in Western Europe for about 1,000 years as we head up to 1500, which is really kind of where we're going to start here. If you remember, the Great Schism in 1054 had split the church into the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is here in the purple, and the Catholic Church, which is the lime color here on this map. And in fact, the word Catholic means universal because it was really the only church in that part of Europe. Of course, it maintained this by punishing anyone who disagreed with it, anywhere from excommunication, being thrown out of the church, to being burnt at the stake. This was the consequence of disagreeing with the church. Consequently, the church became incredibly powerful and incredibly wealthy. It was probably the most powerful political institution in Europe, and it was probably the wealthiest institution in Europe as well. The church collected significant taxes from its followers and imposed taxes on kings and princes as well. And consequently ended up with a fantastic amount of gold. Now in 1500, to celebrate the 1500th anniversary of Jesus' birth, the church announced that it was going to build the greatest church in the world. This church would become St. Peter's Basilica, which you see here. This incidentally is still there, and this is where the Pope lives and works out of today. Now, this church is going to be extremely expensive. The roof, for example, is made out of gold. And so the church ratcheted up their efforts to get money out of the followers in order to build this church, particularly through the sale of indulgences. Now, an indulgence is where you pay the church, and then the church forgives you of some amount of sin. And they began to have sales on these things and let you buy indulgences for other people as a gift and buy them in advance. So if you think you're going to go out and commit a lot of sin, you can go buy indulgences in advance. As you can imagine, many followers of the church saw this as kind of corrupt, and they began to question, is this church really about the teachings of Jesus, or is this church about piling up as much gold as they possibly can? And the most significant among these critics will be Martin Luther, who's a priest in Wittenberg, Germany. And in 1517, he's going to write a letter, and this letter has 95 arguments. It's called the 95 Theses. And they basically question this practice of selling indulgences and the enormous wealth of the church compared to the extreme poverty of its followers. Luther will distribute this letter around his church, and he'll put it on what serves as the church bulletin board, which is the front door, on October 31st, 1517. Many other priests will agree with Luther, and they'll begin using a recently developed piece of technology, Johann Gutenberg's printing press, to make copies of the theses and distribute them around the area. And pretty soon Luther will gain a following of people who start rejecting the Catholic Church, claiming that it has lost its connection with God. And Luther will establish his own church. This is called the Lutheran Church, which still exists today. Others will follow Luther in rejecting the Catholic Church, but they won't all agree with Luther on his ideas about religion. And so we will get lots and lots and lots of different types of Protestantism. More on that in a minute. In the 2 centuries after Luther, huge segments of Europe will fall under the control of Protestants and leave the Catholic Church. And as we see on this map, the purple is the area that is dominated by Protestants, while the blue remains Catholic. But you have to understand, the blue areas are going to have large numbers of Protestants in them who are just being repressed by their governments, as well as the purple areas having lots of Catholics in them who are being repressed by their government. The 1500s and 1600s will be filled with war. They'll be 2 of the bloodiest centuries in the history of the world over these religions. Ironically, of course, Jesus taught peace, but disagreements over what he meant will lead to untold deaths in 200 years of warfare. Christian religion is complicated because of this, because as we see here, you have the first split between the Eastern Orthodox and the first major split anyway, between the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church. And then you have the great Protestant split. These are called Protestants. The root word here is protest, right? Because Martin Luther protested the Catholic Church. And look at all the different varieties of Protestant religion. You've heard of a lot of these. You've heard of Baptists. You've heard of Quakers. You've probably heard of Lutherans and Methodists and some of these other religions. In fact, one of them might be your religion. But the thing to understand here is that there are, in America, there's going to be the Roman Catholics, and they're going to be kind of in opposition to, in many ways, the Protestant religions. But also notice that there's lots of different Protestant religions. But the conflict between these two is going to be one of the main theme in our study of U.S. history. Finally, we've got a chart here showing some of the big differences between the Catholic faith and the Protestant faiths. If you look on the Catholic side, what you're going to see is a very top-down organization where the church tends to be in charge of everything. If you look at the ultimate authority, it's the Pope, not the Bible. The Protestants believe the Bible is the ultimate authority. Speaking of the Bible, the Catholic Church would only allow the Bible to be published in Latin, and restricted ownership of the Bible to the clergy. And of course, the priest and the clergy were the only ones who could read Latin, so it didn't really matter if anybody got their hands on the Bible. Whereas the Protestant faiths believed that the Bible should be translated into the language that people speak and read, and wanted the Bible to be read by all followers. In fact, they would try to get Bibles into as many hands as possible. In the Catholic Church, ritual was heavily emphasized, from baptism to First Communion to marriage to last rites. These rituals were all done through the church. They had to be done by a priest in the church, and were necessary for a soul to get to heaven, according to the beliefs of the Catholic Church. Whereas in the Protestant faiths, ritual was severely de-emphasized, and many of these things depended more on your own personal relationship with God. Catholic churches themselves, the buildings themselves, tend to be incredibly ornate, elaborately decorated, lots of expensive gilded decorations, and the churches tend to be very large. You think of the large medieval cathedrals, or St. Peter's itself, whereas Protestant churches tend to be very plain and simple, much smaller, much less expensive buildings. And finally, the Roman Catholic Church would appoint their the clergy, the priest in your church, would be appointed by Rome, by the leadership of the church in Rome, and every office in the church was controlled ultimately by the papacy, by the Pope's office. Whereas Protestants adopted a new idea. That was where the congregations, the worshipers themselves, would actually choose their minister or their preacher. And so when you add this all up, what you see is the Catholics have a very top-down, hierarchical relationship with God, where everything must flow through the church to God, and from God through the church to the people. The primary thing the Protestants were trying to do was trying to shatter that idea. They wanted to create an individual relationship with God where you didn't need it to go through a church to get to God. Anyway, that was the first lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. There'll be questions about this next time.